So it gets kind of confusing. You kind of like really have to understand what the different tabs are doing. And like actually the B2B Direct Connect is one of them. So there's
Yes.
B2B collaboration, there's B2B Direct Connect, there's
Yeah.
inbound, there's outbound, there's selecting users, there's selecting applications,
Applications. Yeah.
there's
And
everything,
how
there's
does that play with
default.
conditional access policies, right? Like I'm adding guests and I'm giving apps access, and then in conditional access, I can also say guests can access this app or the other.
But this cross-tenant access settings gives you much more control. And the thing that I
Yeah.
love there, which is the other thing that I didn't want to forget about, is the cross-tenant access activity workbook, which
Right.
was at
Yeah.
some point was a internal script for the product group to just see what we were building was working.
Right.
And then it was built out into a workbook, and then it became public, and it was called B2B workbook, I think,
Yeah.
before, and then now it's cross-tenant access activity workbook,
Yeah.
which I don't think many people know about, but that's kind of amazing because that would just show you all inbound and outbound
Yeah.
activity of your users and what's going on in your tenant, which means based on that data, you can create a good policy set. You were talking about what guests are able to see in your tenant, and I know that we had like this really open, they could see everything, they're basically a member when it comes to looking into the directory,
Yes.
versus you could block everything, and then well, everything we said like this is kind of the restricted option, and then we got loads and loads and loads of feedback saying like, well, they can still enumerate this and they can still look at that, and
Yes.
then we came up with the most restricted option, which blocked
Correct.
all of that.
Intro chat with Merrill's live, digging deep where techs thrive. From the latest hacks to cool updates, join the ride, don't be late.
So welcome to another episode of Entra Chat. I'm your host, Meryl Fernando, and today I have Samantha Kloos with me. She's the owner of Argus IT, and Argus IT does security, identity, modern workplace, consultancy, training, and I'll let Sam share about that as well. And today we are going to be talking a lot about B2B, cross-tenant access, guests coming into your tenant, and going to do a deep dive into what are things you should look out for, what all the different things mean. And Sam has been working on a lot of these with the customers. So let's hear what Sam has to tell and share with us your words of wisdom, Sam. Yeah.
So hi Meryl, thanks for inviting me to the podcast. We know each other from being in the same team for years, actually.
Yes.
So before I started my own company, we were in the identity product group together.
Yes, absolutely. So for the very first episode, I actually had Ben on the show because he brought me into the team,
Right. Yeah.
into the same team that we were as part of Get to Production. And it was a really fun chat. Cool. Awesome. So let's jump in. What are things you're seeing when folks are trying to, deploy or get guests in? Is it planned? Is it well planned when companies walk into this, or do they just sort of accidentally get into, cross-tenant access and so
Yeah.
on?
Yeah. I think it's accidental, unfortunately. So usually what you see, and what it's supposed to be, IT is supposed to be supporting of the business, right? So there's a business need for collaborating with other companies, organizations, people, sharing information. And that's obviously where B2B collaboration and all that other good stuff comes in.
Yeah.
But with Microsoft and all the awesome new innovations coming around, things have changed a lot. So I think during our talk, I'm probably going to say like once upon a time when we
Yes.
started this, this is historical data about, things like SharePoint was around for a while before we actually introduced B2B. So SharePoint had its own B2B setup internally to SharePoint that wasn't related to, at that point, Azure AD B2B, but now Entra ID, external ID.
Yes, that adds to the confusion, right? Because there are some settings that are in SharePoint that you go and configure. They're not all in
Right.
Entra, and sort of when you know the history of how these features came about, then it sort of makes sense.
It
But for
makes more
someone coming
sense.
in
Yeah.
new, yeah, if someone comes in new, you're like, why are there so many things in different places and I need to go to different blades to configure?
Yeah.
And there has been sort of consolidation happening, I guess, in the different blades.
Right.
Uh, but yeah, as you said, like I completely forgot about that. But yeah, SharePoint, I think, was the very first product that had brought in this
Right.
concept of
Yes.
guests.
Which makes sense. And like probably it's still the place where it's used most,
Right.
where organizations start sharing documents together and they have to work on
Yes.
those things together, which is fantastic. But
Yep.
it's gotten much better now. It's using external IDs to do that rather than their own internal
Yes.
solution.
Yeah. And how does do the names? What about the names when we say guest and external ID? Does that help?
Again, we will start with like this history of it all.
Yes.
Yeah, so obviously like SharePoint had kind of a B2B solution. Then Azure AD B2B came around, and then we had Azure AD B2C, which was a consumer identity
Right.
part of it. Then I'm saying I'm still kind of stuck in like working for Microsoft. We as Microsoft, but
Yes.
Microsoft
Yep.
um, decided to name it, which actually in this this made sense. Like
Yep.
getting all the external identities. So whether that's a partner organization or whether that's a consumer identity, and kind of get that together and not have like this B2B and B2C. Like we were having so many conversations on when a partner will be a B2C partner over a B2B partner. It's like, no, if it's a partner, it's B2B. If it's a
Yes.
consumer, it's B2C. But then you have these organizations that have such complex relationships with each other where you
Correct.
get
Yeah.
into like it's kind of both. So we
Yes.
need the consumer identities were mostly very focused on having the customization options that you would need
Right.
for it. Create your own portal,
Yeah.
have it feel like your own organization because you're talking to your customers, you're talking to individuals here. And then we have like this big, the FIFA
Yeah.
consumer identity project, which is really cool. You see like these spikes where that's being used.
Yeah.
And then you have the partner organizations, which is usually like more the SharePoint kind of stuff, right?
The
We work together
workforce,
with
right?
them.
Like staff and workforce. But now they are all
Yeah.
called external ID in Entra. Uh, Entra is sort of stepping to external ID for both the corporate and customer sign-ins,
Yeah,
which
I had a
yeah,
look at like what Microsoft.com is doing, and
yes,
I saw that it was saying like external ID for workforce
yeah,
over external ID for external identities. So
yes,
the workforce would be the all B2B, and
correct.
the external identities would then be the B2C.
Business to consumer, yes,
Yeah.
business to business and business to consumer. So how what have you seen, what are you seeing in the field? Like what are the settings you would recommend? Like how would you get companies to approach this whole thing? And let's say they've got this is a state of most folks, right? They would have got an organically invited guests into the tenant, and now they have a bunch of identities, around. Some they would have configured in SharePoint, in adding in the domains and so on. Maybe they're still using the out of the box settings and
Yeah.
for some of those. How would you go about sort of trying to bring all of these in sort of into a healthy state?
Yeah, so I think there's two things that I love about it, and I'm going to say them both so that I don't forget to talk about one.
Right.
But one is the cross-tenant access settings,
Yep.
and the other one is identity governance. So I don't think we should like skip over the identity governance part of this and what it could do for organizations.
Yep.
And I think both are maybe a bit don't get enough attention, which I understand because they've not been around for that long compared to the B2B solution in general.
Right.
And at some point, like organizations will say, well, it's working, right? So let
Yes.
it just work. But consolidating and all that is important. Security obviously is important, and I think that's when you start doing that, identity governance comes in. So we have I'm saying we have again. Microsoft
Yes.
has entitlement management, access reviews,
Right.
all this identity governance things that could help you streamline the processes, and
Right.
access reviews will help you clean up guest accounts that shouldn't be accounts anymore because they're not being used, or
Right.
and make sure that you're in control of all that. I think we also have a couple of options to change now. When at one point we had lots of, instead of having Azure AD having external identities,
Yes.
external ID, you'd have still the need to work together with other companies, right? We've had that
Right.
forever. It's been
Yes.
like, it's been out there before computers. Like, we work together, we collaborate.
Yeah.
Um, so what companies were doing then is just creating an account in their premises Active Directory and give those account details to the person that would need to be working with them. So you'd have all these different accounts and it would get very confusing. And then obviously B2B stepped in and it's like, you can use the same account. You can use an account from your own organization to actually get
Yeah.
access to this other organization and collaborate, which also makes it then very clear that this is a guest account, and you can do different kind of security measures on those accounts,
Yeah.
which is amazing.
It simplifies it for the guests, the users coming into the tenant,
Right.
right? There's no additional username and password that they need to remember. Sort of
Exactly,
like they
writing down
bring
your
their own.
password.
Correct. Yeah. They're bringing their own identity from the other tenant, and the day they lose access to their home tenant, then they would lose access into into the tenant that you're accessing as well, right? So
Right.
it's
If
sort of,
somebody leaves an
yeah,
organization, how would you know, right?
correct.
Otherwise,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, which
So
is another security concern.
yes.
But we have that function now, right, where you could switch your internal guest to an Azure AD. I'm saying Azure AD again.
Yeah.
Entra external ID account. So I think that is a really good consolidation and control part of it as well.
Have you used
Um,
it in any instances, like converting from a guest to a member?
Yeah, yep. I think especially like the big organizations in the Netherlands
Right.
um, had strong needs very
Hmm.
much early on in their business
Right.
for collaboration. So they had a lot of those internal guest accounts, which were a pain
Right.
for them because it is like this management of it. And usually those big organizations, I'm saying like usually like banks, like financial
Right.
institutions, have really strong regulations around what they can and cannot do.
Right.
So with that need for more security came the need to consolidate this,
So
and
they converted guests into member accounts. Was that what they did?
they created member accounts in
Right.
their on premises and just sync them up to the cloud. Yeah,
Got it. Okay. So those folks had they
separate.
would log in with a local username and password of the tenant because they wanted to make sure that they knew the identity security posture, right? Like I guess without it, if a guest comes in, you can say you need to do MFA, but you don't really have much control other than that with the guest. But now with a local identity, you can they created the identities locally, and then you said they sync them, which means they can enforce like password rules and other things that the bank etc. would need to have.
Well, yeah, and the thing was they were it's all there now, right? So they switched to using the B2B collab
Right,
option, but that wasn't already always there, like the option to or trust compliant devices from other
right.
organizations, for
That you
example, which we
correct,
have.
yeah.
Yeah,
That wasn't there before, right? So if they had to do that, then correct. But now you can trust. You have more options now. If you need to have a guest come in but do device compliance checks, you can. But there's
yeah,
still an amount of trust, right? You're trusting the other tenant and their policies on
Definitely.
what the device compliance means for them. Yes, if you're inviting someone into your tenant and you don't know their device posture, you want to do additional checks, it's not really possible, right? You need to sort of trust, and it'll be more like a sort of the contract that you would have the
Yeah.
other organization, right?
Yeah.
On
Which is kind of like a good bridge to the cross-tenant access settings,
yes,
which is also where that that whole thinking about how you collaborate with organizations, where they fit in, how you're going to set that up in your tenant comes in. And I think the um, the difficulty with cross-tenant access settings that all of a sudden it was there. We've had external collaboration settings, and they were under user settings in the tenant, and they still are. There's still settings there. But this cross-tenant access settings gives you much more control. And the thing that I love there, which is the other thing that I didn't want to forget about, is the cross-tenant access activity workbook, which was at some point was a internal script for the product group to just see what we were building was working. And then it was built out into a workbook, and then it became public, and it was called B2B workbook, I think, before, and then now it's cross-tenant access activity workbook, which I don't think many people know about, but that's kind of amazing because that would just show you all inbound and outbound activity of your users and what's going on in your tenant, which means based on that data, you can create a good policy set without actually starting to block critical applications that your users are using externally or other way
So
around.
let's go through the history. So we got cross-tenant, but if we go back, so initially SharePoint had the whole guest invite process, and it was just inside SharePoint. You had nothing to configure in Azure AD then at that time. But in SharePoint, you could do something, I think, like the domains that are allowed, right? That was sort of the only setting I think SharePoint had then. You could say these domains are allowed and these are not allowed, and you would have a list. And I think there was a limit on those lists. So if you're a large company and you had hundreds of these domains that you allowed to the allowed list, I don't think many people use the block list. But if you were doing the allowed list, you had to do that. So that was there. And then Azure AD, when Azure AD introduced the guest B2B at that time, Azure AD also added another list where you can keep those same domains. You could also say what level of access guests have, whether it's restricted, whether they can search for members in the tenant. So that's when Azure AD added that, and you needed to maintain. I remember when I was working as a customer, we had to maintain both the lists. So if we added a domain,
painful.
Yes, we had to add it to SharePoint, and we also have to add it to the Azure AD because SharePoint did only SharePoint, but if it came to Teams, Teams didn't know about the SharePoint list, and you had to work on that Azure AD list. And all of that, the history was it was all only about guests coming into the tenant. You had no idea of your users going into other tenants, right, and accessing them. And as the admin, you had no governance. And that's where cross-tenant access settings and cross-tenant access policies came in, right? So that's sort of like the history of it.
The timeline, yes. Yes. And then we still have all these kind of settings, right? We still have the kind of allow and block list for guest invites in the external identities collaboration settings under the user settings. I think that's still there.
Yes.
And you were talking about what guests are able to see in your tenant, and I know that we had like this really open, they could see everything, they're basically a member when it comes to looking into the directory, versus you could block everything, and then everything we said, like, this is kind of the restricted option. And then we got loads and loads and loads of feedback saying like, well, they can still enumerate this and they can still look at that. And then we came up with the most restricted option, which blocked all of that as well. Yeah.
It does break things,
like, that's
right?
only a couple of years. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. And so that is when a guest comes in, you can say it's restricted, which means the guest can't search for anyone in the organization, which means they can't do a lookup and assign or
Yeah.
tag people as well, right? They need to know the exact email address of
Yeah, exactly. I
others
think there was like one in between where they could still see if they were in a group, they would be able to see the
within
group
the group,
members.
right?
Yeah, and the last one is just like they just can't see basically.
Right,
They can see themselves, and that's
right.
and their access, and that's it. Yeah.
And depending on your organization setting, you would pick which one would make sense to you.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
There's actually a new recommendations from Microsoft. If you go to ak.ms/Entra security recommendations, I'll add it in the show notes. One of the core settings that's there as a security restriction is for external collaboration. The default is guests can invite other guests. I think it'll be a miss if we don't talk about that setting. So
Yes. Default tenant setting.
yes, the default tenant setting is you have guests come in. Now they can invite any other guest into the tenant.
Yep.
And I guess it was at that time to make it easier to collaborate with others. And so, right. So if you are inviting, say, Contoso, one person from Contoso into the org, and they come in to a team site or a SharePoint site, now they have the ability to invite others in, and that's the default. So there is a recommendation now that says the first one is to change that. Don't allow guests, change it so that it's members that can invite members. And there are those other external collaboration security settings as well, like restricting access to the what we spoke about, right? Whether the guest can see all the users in the tenant or whether they can only see the users in the team site that they are added to. You can limit those. So those are like tenant level settings from a security perspective. I thought we should call it out since we are talking
Yeah,
about
definitely.
that
Yeah.
setting.
Yeah. And this is also where you get into like well, the part like what users are inviting other users, right? You could restrict it completely. You have this guest inviter role that you could work with, but usually that's too limited
Right.
because lots of organizations are working on collaboration platforms and like Teams.
Right.
And when you start using Teams, you want to collaborate with others. And
Yes.
once upon a time, there we go again. Once upon a time, we only
Yeah.
had the B2B collaboration option. So you would like guest invite somebody that's not in your tenant yet via your Teams, and
Yeah.
they get added to your tenant, and they get like this whole email invite if you don't use
Yes.
the API, which then you can turn it off and not send the email. But they will get into your tenant and then they start collaborating like that. Nowadays, you have that B2B Direct, what are we calling it? Connect?
Direct Connect.
B2B
Yeah. So
Direct
what's
Connect.
that? So before we go into that, I still want
Yeah.
to cover cross-tenant access settings because
Oh,
I
yeah.
feel like we didn't really go there, right? So there are
Give
so
it.
many settings there, right? We spoke about you having visibility of where your users are going into other tenants. And I think cross-tenant access was the first time you got, as an admin, the ability to control where your users were going into other tenants, right? So like there is default, inbound, outbound. Like how do you sort of manage that? Like what are some of the recommendations you provide customers when they are looking at?
Yeah, so it gets kind of confusing. You kind of like really have to understand what the different tabs are doing. And like actually the B2B Direct Connect is one of them. So there's
Yes.
B2B collaboration, there's B2B Direct Connect, there's
Yeah.
inbound, there's outbound, there's selecting users, there's selecting applications,
Applications, yeah.
there's
And
everything.
how
There's
does that play with
default.
conditional access policies, right? Like I'm adding guests and I'm giving apps access, and then in conditional access, I can also say guests can access this app or the other. Like like what sort of
Most
approach you? Yeah, it's
Yeah,
confusing.
most
Yeah.
restricted. Yeah, it is confusing. And most
Yeah.
restricted would go, right? If you block it somewhere, it's going to be blocked.
Yeah. Right.
It might not be a great
Okay.
experience. Like, I don't know why, but every single time I go into an organization and I look at their conditional access policies, there there are some, we're not doing conditional access today, but there
Yeah.
are some like really basic things that go wrong,
Right.
which I understand because conditional access is like I think the biggest product for identity insecurity, definitely and it
Yeah.
has been for a while. And although Microsoft's doing everything they can to make it as easy for everyone to be able to use it, um, it's gotten complex.
Right. Yeah.
And it's gotten complex, especially for maybe like the smaller organizations that don't have a dedicated identity team, where the Office 365 team Microsoft 365 team has to manage it, or the
Yeah. The
security team do it.
Intune team have their stuff. Yeah. That's
Yeah,
yeah. All of
yeah, and
that's
you
true.
get like
But
these
yeah.
things where like they're enabled, but they're not targeted, so they're not doing it's not doing anything, and
Right.
admins would say like, well, but it's enabled, it's on green. Like I know,
Right.
but it's not targeting
You're
anything,
not
so it's not
targeting
going to
anyone.
do
Right.
anything.
Yeah. That's true.
So
Yeah.
stuff like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
I like your rule of thumb, which is, I think that's some of those golden rules are good to remember. So when you talk about guests and you can control guests through conditional access, where you can say, you target guests and define policies, right? They can access these apps. Maybe you can only access M365. If you're coming in as a guest, you cannot access any other app, right? Because by default, guests can access every app in Entra, which could be the intranet, which you might not want a guest to access. Maybe if you have intranet other than SharePoint, or maybe SuccessFactors or Salesforce, you don't want them going into those other applications. Um, so you said like you can control it there. You can control it in cross-tenant access settings as well. You can say if a guest is coming here, block access to these apps and allow. But I liked your rule, which is the most restrictive setting applies. So if it's blocked in conditional access, they get blocked. If it's blocked in cross-tenant access setting, they get blocked there as well. Yeah, and that's I've never heard that before, and so it's a good thing. I'm going to steal that phrase when explaining to people, right? That the most restrictive thing applies. So
yeah,
how do you usually recommend? Because there's a default setting, and then you
yeah.
can configure company specific policies. How do you do, because you can do skin it so many ways, right? You can by default allow, by default block, and then allow. What are the, what do you recommend?
Yeah.
What you
If
see is more successful?
it feels like I'm going against my own what I've been evangelizing for years because of the conditional access versus the cross-tenant access settings, right? So
Yeah.
with conditional access, we've seen a lot of organizations go block all and then poke
Yes.
holes in it, which is not
Correct.
great with conditional
Yeah. Not
access.
for conditional access. Yes.
It's called conditional access for a reason, right? It's
Yeah.
about the access and not about blocking. Because when you poke holes, there's stuff that services that you can't select and you
Yes.
can't poke holes into, and then team starts misbehaving and everybody's
Yes.
very, very sad. So definitely that will be allow and then block specifically if you need to. But then with cross-tenant access
Yeah.
settings, I think like it's the workbook first, right? It's the IT supporting business needs. So these are the business needs. This is what you have now. This is what activity that you see. You
Yeah.
might find something that you don't want to allow, but there you go. That's a good thing. You have the settings to do that now. And then usually I'd go for the default settings, block all.
Right.
And then specifically for organizations, allow what you need to allow.
Right. So default policy for inbound, that's guests coming into your tenant, you would say make sure it's all locked down. For guests coming in, you block, and then you have different, for every company you get them in, you would then allow access to the apps that they do need to have access. And you can also control the group, right, of users that need access. That would it differ based on industry, and if you are like a small medium
Yeah, so the thing is,
business?
like, I
And
work
yeah.
with like finance and government a lot, so
Right.
which is also why I go with like the control and
Right.
the block it. You obviously don't necessarily have to do that. You can work on your default settings to
Yeah.
allow Microsoft 365, allow Teams for everyone
Right.
if that's how you collaborate in your organization, right?
Yeah.
So set the defaults to like the most restrictive that you need, and then start
Yeah.
building more open collaborations with other organizations.
Right. Yeah. That makes sense, right? And like all of these, and that's why Microsoft gives these settings, because it's like ordering pizza for like 1 million customers, right? Like
Yeah.
each company wants different things and they have different needs. I was working with of my like one of my relatives. He was having a small company, like there are only like 20 people, and we sort of secured it, and then he's like collaborating with someone, one of his customers, and it's a deal contract they're working on, and it was locked down, like they couldn't share the doc because the domain was not allowed listed yet. And he was like, I lose this business, my business won't exist if I don't have this contract. And he's like, just remove all these things, I just want things to work. So
Yeah. Yeah.
so it's like it depends on the needs, right? And if
Yeah, and
it's
it shouldn't
enterprise. Yeah.
IT shouldn't get in the way. It's like I was talking to my customer last week, and
Right.
we were talking about like these security well, guardrails. You know, when you go bowling, you have like these kiddie reels. Like I don't
Oh,
know even know what they're called. But I kind of like I was explaining identity security
right.
in that way, where we
Nice.
all go bowling, and then we have these guardrails. That's like our identity security. It's in there. So when people start bowling and actually collaborate and all that, we have those
Yeah.
guardrails to fix it and make sure that they go the right direction. And
Right.
if they're good at bowling, they won't even
Yeah.
notice that we're there, right? They will
Yeah.
just hit. And they're like, so, but what's the goal around? It's like, well, hit the keg, like hit. It's
Hit the
bowling.
pins.
You have to
Yeah.
like hit the pins. Yeah, it's the pins. Yeah. So it worked. So
Nice.
that's my new metaphor for
Oh,
security. Yeah.
that's definitely a good one. Nice. What about outbound access? Like if you're a company and users are going out, accessing to other tenants, have you seen that being locked down? Because most folks I know don't even know that there's such a setting because it's new with cross-tenant. Um, is that something you've seen people configure in their tenants?
I've not seen it a lot, to be fair. Again, with finance,
Right.
it's more on their mind what they're doing. But that like the focus there is more on their the people in their organization um, behaving correctly on
Right.
in collaborations on with their account, making sure that they're not doing things that they shouldn't with their company account. Yeah, but I've not seen it a lot, so you haven't either,
It's mostly in finance. In some of the banks,
right?
I've seen where they're like, they're not going as guests to any other place except there's a process they need to ask for requests, and then they get added to a group, and then they can go as a guest to collaborate because their rule is all of the documents should live in the banks, in their SharePoint or team sites. There should be no collaboration on documents that are in other tenants. So that, yeah, I haven't seen it outside of finance
No, I don't think I have either.
in there as well.
No.
Because the thing is, the other problem with restricting too much is what happens is people just start emailing the document, right? And then you lose all of the whole visibility and
That's the thing. Like, yeah, with the bowling like metaphor, you'd like at one point, if you start blocking everything, you just go
yeah,
to the next lane, right? That's
yeah,
open, and you just start shooting there. So the uh, that is a real concern with locking
yeah,
down to the point where you're not no longer supporting the business, but getting in front of the business.
yes,
Like with
yeah,
your example,
yeah,
like I cannot lose this contract. I have to collaborate here. And
yes,
if you're a smaller company, it's easy to say like, well, get rid of it, make sure that we can collaborate. But if you're in a big company and you have this whole process to go through, or you don't even
yeah,
know where to go because you don't know who owns like this list where you have to like get
right,
on to get access,
yeah.
that means you losing the contract. Yeah.
Exactly. And people will find a way, right? Like they need to get work done
Mm.
and they they're not they're not aware of all of the security and those risks, right? And I know
Right.
when Teams was completely locked down in an org, and what happened is people just started using WhatsApp, and then the first were chatting, and then they're sharing documents as well through
Yeah.
that. So you lose
Like,
visibility of it.
yeah, and we have like AI now, and people pushing stuff into ChatGPT, and
Oh,
like it's going everywhere, right? So I'm I'm starting to evangelize data classification and labeling and all of that more because it's going to be so. It's it was already important, but it's so clear now. It's like even you using AI within your company, you want to have a grip on your data. You want to make sure that the right people can get to the right data because if you give
correct.
them like this nice AI portal to go and find documentation and you can find the stuff that HR is looking at and
Yes.
read the whole list of like all stuff that you shouldn't know about your organization, that's not great. So that has become so much more important.
Yes. Yeah, that's definitely a thing that confuses folks. Right. So if you talk about the settings in cross-tenant access, the one that trips people is this B2B Direct Connect. Like, what's that, and what's the history there, and how did like where do you see that being used versus guest access, the usual B2B flow?
Yeah, it has a bit of a history. I was actually working with that team when that came about because there was Teams and other Microsoft 365 products were working on these cross-tenant, but like multi-tenant, like organizations with multiple tenants within their
Right.
organization functionality. So that's kind of where this came from. So we were working on giving them a set of features so that if you'd had multiple tenants for whatever reason, usually like legal, regulatory kind of reasons,
I've
you
seen
would be able to work
mergers and acquisitions
mergers,
as well.
acquisitions. Yeah, that was one too. You have a good reason to have multiple tenants, but you have a way to collaborate as if you were one organization because you are one organization,
Right.
and that was really difficult between tenants. So you had to like guest invite around, and
Yeah,
like it was
guest the
messy.
process has improved quite a lot now for guest invite and so on. But before, there were a lot of failures when you did a guest invite, right? Like you would send
Yeah.
the invite, they didn't get the email, or they clicked and then they went somewhere else, and they were
Yep.
signed into their personal account, and they saw something
Yep.
else, and
It was
like
actually
there
really
was
cool, and we have loads of
yeah,
information in it in the logs and everything now. But like
yeah,
at one point, our team had to create like this script to find out what number because we would give it like it was given a number. So if you use an API to find this redemption,
right,
or if it's not redeemed yet, you could see like 1 through 6, I think, and then
right.
one was a guest account in another external
Oh, okay, each
Azure
different
AD.
codes.
2 was an Outlook account, and 3 was
Right,
Gmail, and like et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, that's where that started.
nice. And so so Direct Connect came about where you didn't really need to
Yes,
do a guest invite, and it
right.
was
So
like
like
more
you
the
just
two
one,
as you treat as one. But it's a config that both tenant admins need to do, sort of like build that trust, right, between the
right? Yeah,
two
because
tenants.
when it came about, so we had that multi-tenant organization that would need to work as one organization because it was one organization, and then we were building all kind of features in the identity product group. But Teams at one point, I was like, we needed to go a bit
Yeah,
further than what you're doing, and we couldn't go any further with B2B collaboration um, to get where Teams needed us
Teams.
to be.
Right.
So that's when B2B Direct Connect came
Direct
about,
Connect.
out of that need for teams to be able to collaborate within Teams, chat in Teams without having to switch tenants, which was a pain. It's much better now, actually, but it
Yes.
was a
Yes.
real pain having to do that because it would like kill everything else, and then you have to go to the other tenant, and it
Right.
was
Yeah.
horrible.
If you're in a call and
Um,
you accidentally click, you you got disconnected, right? And
yeah,
when you switched
trying to
over
get
to the
in the
other
call with the
tenant,
same person.
right.
Yeah,
But Teams, they've done so much work now that the Teams client now works even as a guest, and it doesn't even
yeah,
matter if you're a guest or not. Like you can be as a guest in another tenant and be on a call, and it doesn't really hurt.
Yeah, you have a good experience now. Yeah, but it wasn't like that. So, but and that was like that's where the B2B Direct Connect was born, um, out of that need, which basically like you can collaborate, and I think it's still only Teams that uses
Yes,
Direct
yeah.
Connect, right?
No
Yeah.
other app, because it needed every product to make changes to how it
Hmm.
worked. It was cool. It was a cool idea because you didn't need to sync identities. With B2B and even the new multi-tenant org, you have to sync identities between tenants. With B2B Direct Connect, you don't need to, because you do this cross-tenant settings on both sides. You sort of establish sort of like a trust, and then you
Yep.
can give access to a group of users from the other tenant. So there's no sync and there's no switching off the tenant, signing in and out. You could do, but it required a lot of work for each app. So even
Right.
if you're building an external app like ServiceNow, etc., it doesn't work for any of those. And even I don't think even SharePoint and others support it much. So it's just Teams, and it does give a good experience. But even that, there is this shared channel, right? It has to be a specific channel you need to create within a team, and you can only
Yeah.
chat within that channel. If you have other channels, then those users cannot see them, collaborate with them.
Yeah, because it is a whole separate stream, right? It is that direct
Yeah.
connect where that works, and the great thing is that you can collaborate without having to invite. But what I've seen happening with actually lots of my customers is where this need comes from Teams. It came from Teams internally at Microsoft. It's coming from the Teams business and collaboration in the organizations at our customers, which is then where this whole marketing kind of campaign comes in, where it's like, you don't have to invite users anymore. You can just collaborate with anybody, anywhere, anytime. And everybody goes like, that is amazing. That's what we need. That's what we're going to do. And I have one customer, and they did this whole user adoption on Teams. It was on their whole modern workplace actually, but it was very much focused on using Teams because that was new for their employees.
Right.
So they all went into these trainings, and they came out, and I got a call from the Microsoft 365 admin, and they said like, we can't actually collaborate with anyone in our shared channels. I'm like, why not? It's like, well, we had these Teams training, and they said like we could just collaborate with anyone. It's like, have you set up your cross-tenant access settings? And they go like, the what? I'm like, your cross-tenant access settings. It's like, I've not looked at that. It's like, well, then you haven't, because also the organizations that you're going to do that Teams collaboration with have to set up something
on the other side,
for you to be able to see their users, and they get like this little pop-up like that, like this not privacy related information that you're going to share, but you at least have to open it up a little bit so that we can like make sure that you can chat in Teams and share in Teams and work together in Teams. But like that obviously hasn't worked. So now they've told the whole organization that they can do this with Teams and collaborate with anybody that they want. And obviously they can't because the cross-tenant access settings part hasn't been set up yet.
Right. So once they do that, it works. What should people use that? Like, what do you recommend when you meet customers, like when they want to do this? Do you even give that as an option to them on using Direct Connect, or just
I like it. It's go with the guesting. No, I like the Teams collaboration option. One, it also means you don't have to do the governance over those guest accounts because you're just collaborating directly without having to invite these, which means a lot cleaner tenant if the need is only within Teams. If you only have to collaborate with an organization within Teams, why go through the mess of inviting guests and having to review them and all of that? So I like it in that part, but all of this needs good business processes. Both B2B collaboration and B2B Direct Connect need good business processes for this to work.
The big part is not the tech part, it's more the business side of things, right? Like when you have, and you need to have like an overall strategy of what's your security policy if it's one of your own companies, like sister, maybe it's a company that you own, like mergers and acquisitions. It's like we had this diagram, right, which had like layers of partners and how much trust you have with them.
Yeah.
If it's a merger,
Yeah,
if
we
it's
have like the whole. I
the,
remember that. That was
yeah,
Harvint, I think.
yes. It's a good and like that's a nice way. I like the visual that it provides, where if you own the company, you can tell them, right? Like you can tell the other admin, this is the settings and you're part of the same org. But then if you are in a group of companies, then you don't really have control. You're just, there's a holding company that owns all of the different orgs, but you do trust and work with each other quite a lot. But you can't dictate sometimes the IT rules to the other org, and you'll need to then, define the trust
Right.
policies in that way. And then you go to like vendors who are like the next level of vendors, suppliers, and then customers, right? Like, do you
Yeah,
even
yeah, we
get them
had
in
this
as guests?
whole
Yeah.
it went out, right? We had multi-org and B2B and
Yes.
vendors and yeah,
Yeah.
customers.
I really like that as a way to introduce the whole concept of B2B, because if without that, it's like, where do you start, you know, explaining what B2B and B2C and the layers of trust
Yeah.
that
Yeah, and
works
then
there.
there's the whole like I think we kind of skipped over it, right? Because we've mentioned multi-tenant orgs a
Yes.
few times. So that it uses that cross-tenant sync to actually sync around the identities.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to mention like the basic how it works in a tenant with the guest and the member users, because you can have extra. So it's going to be
Yeah.
gonna be weird
Confusing
talking
to
about this, but yeah,
explain. Yes.
confusing to explain this without like having the table with it. But like, we have the guests and we have the members, right? And that's all again based on the business relationship that you have with
Yeah.
somebody. So whether if it's within your organization, you see it as a member relationship. If it's outside, you would see it as a guest relationship with your
Correct.
organization. But then you can have internal and external guests, and you can have internal and
And
external
external.
members.
Yes.
So depending on where you sit, but you could like guest somebody in with using Azure AD, Entra,
Yes.
external ID, um, and change them over to a member. If that's the business relationship that you have with somebody, they might be using an account from a different tenant from outside your organization, but still be a member of your organization for some
Right.
reason, not have. They could still be a member
Right.
organization.
And
You see that
licensing
quite a lot
comes
with
into play then, right? When it's a
licensing.
member. It's a whole thing we didn't talk about, I
Right, yeah, we
guess.
kind of
And
skipped over it.
yeah.
Like I think like you're famous obviously with all the information that you share around. I remember that you had this really cool that went viral, at least like here in the Netherlands. Like they
Yeah.
talk about that a lot. I get to these community events and like, have you seen Meryl's post on this? It's like, yep, I've seen it. But you had this little one post say, I like your visuals, and that this visual did like you only need one license per user, like
Correct.
across
Per
everything that you
heartbeat.
use.
Yeah.
Everybody goes like, what?
Like I have conversation literally this week. Like I get emails all the all the time about that, and it's also because people are used to the M365 licensing model, which you have to assign to a person for things to work. Entra, you don't really have to assign the license explicitly, but you do need to have, that number of licenses for the features that people use. And Entra, you create multiple accounts, right? Like admin accounts. So one person can have multiple identities in one tenant, and they could have even identities in other tenants, and that's where that comes in. So I was really happy when we had like a formal blog post that explained all of that, because before that we only had one tweet from Alex Simmons, who's our identity VP, who sort of shared that rule, which is he said one license per heartbeat for Entra ID, P1 and P2. But they have fleshed that out, and there's an external, like the blog post that we can point people to, which
Good.
talks
Yeah.
about that. Because identity governance is a new SKU, and that has the guest licensing model as well, right?
Yeah. Remember where that came from? Because that once upon a time was like you had the 1 to 5
Correct. Yes. I mean, you
licensing
still
models.
have that, right? By default, if you
Yeah.
create a tenant and you have licenses for Entra ID, you can have, for every one license you have, you can have 5 guests in the tenant for the month, active users signing in.
And old contracts still have that as well. Like if
Yes.
they haven't switched to the new model yet. But like the new model, I think gives you like 50,000 guests. The
Correct.
first 50K is
50,000
free, right?
monthly active users, not just
Active
in
users.
the identity. So not just in Entra ID, they need to be signing in, which I think doesn't. But you need to still go and configure that, which I don't think many orgs have done. You still need to go and configure that in Azure Entra, link it to a subscription, because that's when it switches to that other billing model, because the billing is then more usage based, and there's even a cost for SMS and things which
Yeah,
you
SMS
don't.
is a cost. Yeah, I think that's the only
Sure.
separate one, isn't it?
Yes, yeah. So
Yeah.
if you have lots of guests, that's that makes a lot more sense. Depending obviously on the number of licenses you have, right?
Yeah.
If I have a customer with like 100,000 licenses, by default they get like 500,000. So they wouldn't go for the 1 to 5. I mean, they would stick with the 1 to 5 instead of the 50K, right? Because
Yeah. Well,
they,
still like the 50K, I think at some point we looked at our numbers and I think we didn't have any that were hitting the 50K active per
monthly
month.
active.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know how it is today. Maybe some
Yes.
really, really, really big organizations are hitting it.
Yeah.
But usually you're going to be like totally fine with 50K per month. And won't even cut close. But then that's also why the cross-tenant activity workbook kind of comes in, right? You could see what's happening.
Correct. Yeah. You can see from the activity. And I also like the new licensing utilization blade. So that too gives you a view of how the license is being used, so which can be a guide for you to know, do I have enough licenses in my tenant to, cover for that? So that's something that the Entra team have added to make it really easy for organizations to know if they are in the clear when it comes to whether they have enough licenses for the features that they're using.
Yep.
Yeah, that's definitely a good one. Yeah, so licensing and guests that's another whole part of the conversation, right? So it's a lot when you sort of try to step into guests and managing guests and those identities. You would
And trying to wrap your head around how that works and how that works with that one license, one heartbeat kind of situation.
Yeah, that definitely simplifies things.
Yeah.
Because you don't really need to worry so much. Some said, I was speaking to one customer yesterday, and they were from the licensing team. They were a big enterprise org, and they were like, this is so bad, like that you can use features without assigning license. I want it to be simple, and I want to be like M365, explicitly assign the license, because for them, then the numbers are cleaner. Like you can't use features that you haven't paid for.
I guess it's easier for like compliance and auditing and
Yeah,
reporting.
so the
Yeah, I
compliance
get
team,
that.
they were the ones who were saying like, I want it to be the other way around, where you have to explicitly assign the license. But I I personally don't know the reasons why, but I feel like things like conditional access, it needs to be so quick for users signing in and having to do a license check at that time for users. I feel like it would add to that overhead whenever users sign in for these core
Especially with
capabilities, right?
especially with security features. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, when you need to like check for the licensing and then do so, it's more like most Entra features are like tenant level license features. And yeah, that makes sense when you're doing that, right? Because I remember Entra for a long time, Entra was all running on bare metal, right? Azure AD was when they had to provision physical servers. It Azure AD was not using VMs when like for the service that is Azure AD, they had to have physical machines, and it was running on bare metal at that time.
They had to scale fast. Yeah.
Yes, during those COVID years. But yeah, I think that gave a lot of headway for all the growth that happened.
Definitely, yeah. It pushed for collaboration and remote working, didn't it? So,
Yeah.
yeah.
So we touched on identity governance for guests, and so that's an important thing, right? You don't want to have identities staying on in your tenant when they don't have access, like when they don't need to have the access. And there's licensing as well that comes in. Have you seen people use the licensing capabilities with doing access reviews and entitlement management for guests?
Yeah, I've seen big use of access reviews. That's pretty big, and especially again, it's the finance that's been pretty big on it, being compliant and needing to be compliant and all that. So we have some big banks here in the Netherlands that have been actively
Right,
using access reviews since the start. Some with like our product teams working on access reviews and
right.
working through that and actually breaking the
Yes.
the system at some point.
How
Um,
do they set up the access reviews? Like, is it someone from the guest organization, the sponsor, that approves, rejects, or is it like in each owner of the group that does the review, or does it come to a central
Well,
IT team to do because they need to
yeah.
do a final, first the guests would self-nominate whether they need access or not, but then who makes that final review of the access?
Yeah, so they did a project based. So they had these big project teams.
Right,
Um, and those project managers were the ones responsible for all the people working in their project. So they would
right.
be the ones reviewing whether the guests were
Yeah,
still working on those projects and still need access to those projects. And they did it
right.
like bi-yearly, I think. Yeah, every half
Bi-yearly.
year.
Is
Yeah.
bi-yearly like every
Every
6 months?
half year, every 6 months. Is that bi-yearly? No, that's it's
I, I really get confused with the bi
I don't
thing. When
know.
someone says bi-monthly, like what do you mean by that? Is it like twice?
Is that every 2 months or is
Is
it
it every
like
other
every
month or is
half?
it twice a month?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm like every 6 months is what I was going for. So
Right.
yeah, every 6 months they did the
Cool.
review.
Right. So
Yeah.
every six
And
months
they did,
and
and they were so big, and they were doing that when it was still in preview, working with
right.
the product team. So they broke it 2 times. Like
Right.
they just like yeah.
Uh,
So we had to scale a lot. Microsoft
Nice.
learned a lot. So
Yeah.
it was really good. That was a
It is.
really good
Yeah.
collaboration with the customer.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's heavily used now. And today you can use a lot of those features with just a P2. But if you use the machine learning or the automated removal of access, there's a nice table that's there. And I think Jeff helped put that together. There's the new identity governance for guests. And if I remember the blog post, it's, what is it, 12 cents per month or something for that for guests, where you can use those advanced features in identity governance
Yeah, the
that
identity
lets you,
governance queue. Yeah.
yeah, there's a nice comparison of the capabilities that you have. So you can do a lot with just Entra ID P2, depending on the number of licenses you have in the tenant. And if you need the identity governance features, which add a nice layer of reducing workload on the admins, and it can automatically remove access for guests once they are no longer in having any
Yeah, and they have this
tenants.
really nice setting, right? In access reviews, they didn't have that in the start, but they put in this like specifically for guest users. So you can just
Yes.
select all guest users, so only do access reviews for all guest users rather than for your
Correct.
whole tenant, which makes it much easier to start with access reviews,
Yeah.
where that is such a clear like business case to do that for guest users. Whilst if you have to figure out what you want to do and how you want to do it per like group or per like project with
Yes.
like your member users in there as well, it's much more difficult. But that's again where like who's a guest user comes in, right? Where you could like, and why that's important, why that business relations is important, and to have that set correctly in your tenant.
Correct. Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
So how
Wow.
about entitlement
Yeah.
management, Meryl? So
Yes.
I love it. I love the whole concept of entitlement management, having that whole life cycle from joiner,
Yes.
mover, leaver, all that. It's amazing for projects. It's amazing for guest users. Um, can we already, like, this is me doing a feature request, right? So are we already able to like kind of migrate our current B2B guest users into entitlement management?
When you say migrate, in the sense
So
doing the joiner mover
like
lever
yeah,
flow?
so when I get to customers, when they are not using B2B collaboration at all yet, I just go
Yes.
like, yes, that means we
Yeah.
can do entitlement management.
Yes.
We're going to start with entitlement management.
Correct. Yeah.
Every guest user is going to be in this life
Yes.
cycle, and
Yeah.
it's going to be amazing. And I get all excited,
Yes.
and then we go do that, and those are fantastic, like in control.
Correct. Yeah, you do the access packages, the guest comes in
Exactly.
and they
Yeah,
don't have
exactly.
access to anything. You send them to the My Access page where they can request access. And uh, I believe if people have been watching the Entra Suite showcases and the demos, it talks about all of that because it's about identity governance and also giving them access to even on-prem apps through global secure access. So you're not just only doing cloud applications and all of that tied together with access reviews and access packages and having full blown visibility and tenant health
Oh,
in your
now I
tenants.
want
Yeah.
to do that same life cycle on my already existing B2B guest users.
Right. Yes. I think it's a phased approach you need to take with that. Just like with any other, if you have your own employees, right? You're rolling ID governance, you would need to create those access packages and move. I believe there is some reporting capabilities that have been built that sort of help try to discover what people have access to and then help create some of those for you because you can see based on the sign in and the usage what apps people are using and so on, right? And sort of help put that together.
But not an easy button, like put these guest users into this access package and put them into this life cycle whilst not having to reinvite them.
I don't think you need to reinvite them. You can still move them into the access packages. So that's definitely there. Yes, nice. Cool. So I feel like we covered a lot, but we could still keep on going
Yes, it
into
is a lot.
yeah, I didn't like I was like, and you wanted to do 2 topics today.
We
um,
kind of hit on some of the default settings though. Yeah.
yes, yeah, that's true. That's true. But yeah, that's a whole another topic for
Yeah.
another day.
Another day.
But yeah, this I think was a really good talk or chat about all of the different Entra guests. I don't think we even went a lot into multi-tenant org, the new syncing and all of those capabilities. I thought I'll leave that for another day because just these concept of cross-tenant access itself, more the security side of guests, and then we touched on licensing. Those are really good topics to
Get Arvin to talk to you about the multi-tenant org stuff.
Yes.
He breezed that, so that he's gonna love that.
I've definitely pinged a few of them, and we'll definitely have them on to talk about that. Perfect. It was so good. So good seeing you, Samantha.
Yeah,
And,
same
I'm
here.
sure
Thanks for
we
the
will
invite.
have you more on the chat in the coming months as I,
Good luck.
go through all of that. I want to
Yeah,
make this
no,
a
it's really
weekly
good.
one,
Yeah.
so we'll see how it
Yeah,
goes.
thank you that like for all you do, like for like the like obviously like I'm now just like outside and
Okay.
in the community, so I profit from it like even more like being on the outside now.
Yeah.
So great work, like and
Oh,
everybody's loving it.
thank you so
So
much.
you're famous in like the best sense of
For me, it's about taking folks from the community and highlighting and sharing, like bringing you on, and that's what I want this podcast to be also. It's having more guests from the community coming and talking. We want to learn from people who actually deploying all these features and hear their stories and share that with the wider community.
yeah, amazing. No, it's very much appreciated all you do for the community and sharing all the information, knowledge you have.
And it's
Yeah,
so much fun for me. Like this is my 5th recording. I have so much fun every session, every chat,
good,
and I learn. So it's a lot of fun meeting and talking to different folks from all over the world.
awesome. Keep doing what you're doing.
Cool. Thank you so much for coming on, Sam.